Happy 34-year anniversary! Today we're going to be talking about one of the most significant terrorist attacks on New Zealand soil. Whee! Hello and welcome, my name's Gliscor 101 and this is Uniquely New Zealand, the show where I talk about anything and everything New Zealand. So, the Rainbow Warrior. Last month, July the 10th, marked the 34-year anniversary of the sinking of the Rainbow Warrior. While you might not have heard the story, it's an incredibly significant one, as it's one of the big driving forces that led the nuclear-free movement that New Zealand is kinda well known for now. While it is quite a sad story to tell, I would argue it's a significant one, as it gives you insight into how the country got to be how it is, and some of our political history. However, to properly tell this tale, we first have to go back to a dark and depressing era in New Zealand's history. The 80s. It's become a bit of a running gag on this show that anytime the 80s comes up, it's bad. The hot button issue we're discussing today is New Zealand's stances on nuclear energy. Interestingly enough, New Zealand already kind of had a negative policy towards nuclear energy. However, that didn't stop other countries from testing their fancy new nuclear weapons just off the coast of us on some islands that were uninhabited. Our government didn't really push too hard to stop this, because of course it wasn't technically their jurisdiction. However, it did lead to a large series of protests. One such ship protesting this was the Rainbow Warrior, the crown jewel of Greenpeace's anti-nuclear arsenal. Nice boat, right? Pretty cool? These protests were actually getting so successful that France had to come up with a way to retaliate. Retaliate against peaceful protests. So, on July the 10th, 1985, a group of French intelligence officers undertook a mission to sink the Rainbow Warrior while it was docked in Auckland, with the crew still inside. The plan had two main steps: trigger one explosion so that the crew would be alerted and hopefully evacuate, and then trigger a second explosion 10 minutes later to actually bring down the ship. Unfortunately, things did not go to plan. When the second explosion hit just before midnight, 35-year-old activist Fernando Pereira died while trying to retrieve his camera. The sinking of the Rainbow Warrior was not just a crime. It was an act of government-approved terrorism. And it was done for the sole purpose of stopping a peaceful protest against nuclear energy and weapons. In the aftermath of the attack, the New Zealand government quite quickly and correctly identified it as an act of terrorism, and the New Zealand police worked quickly to figure out what had happened. The first major break occurred when a neighbourhood watch organisation managed to identify two of the suspects involved, and the police were able to apprehend them. I don't want to focus too much on the France side of things because, hey, it's uniquely New Zealand, but I will recap the highlights. The French government denied involvement for a long time. However, over the course of a few decades, we slowly learned how high this thing actually went, with the president himself at the time actually approving the operation. Ultimately, the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior ended with New Zealand and France's relationship being fractured for years, many agents getting away scot-free and those being caught only serving minimal sentences, and a man losing his life. There was not a lot of justice here. Honestly, this coverage of a terrorist attack is getting to be kind of a bummer, so let's get to the silver lining. Before the attack, there was some legislation the government had in the works that would have stopped nuclear ships and weapons from entering our harbours. However, these were getting a lot of pushback, specifically from New Zealand's allies. The United States, and France of course, were pushing back hard on these legislations, and there's a chance they wouldn't have gone in. However, after the Rainbow Warrior, there was a huge surge in popularity amongst the Kiwi people for nuclear-free legislation. Suddenly there were a lot more protests and campaign against nuclear energy, power and weapons that really forced the government's hand. All of this led to the passing of the New Zealand Nuclear Free Zone Disarmaments and Arms Control Act, a first-of-its-kind legislation that led to New Zealand's nuclear-free future. With a wide sweep of public support, this act passed and became one of the most popular bits of New Zealand legislation to this day. Politicians on both sides of the political spectrum support this act, and even though it's been nearly 30 years, no politician or government party has ever tried to repeal it, despite continued pressure from foreign governments. This has led to nuclear-free New Zealand being a very important part of New Zealand's political history. The sinking of the Rainbow Warrior was an act of government-approved terrorism, which was specifically done to bully people into silence. However, it did not do this. It led to protests, rallies, and countless brave Kiwis standing up and making their voices heard, just like the crew of the Rainbow Warrior. And that is truly uniquely New Zealand.